Chuck Norris boarded a flight from Sydney to Los Angeles one December morning, and something absolutely amazing, perhaps the most hilarious, jaw-dropping incident you'll ever hear, unfolded in the front cabin. It all began with a single dismissive remark from an overconfident businessman. That one sneering insult triggered a chain of events so extraordinary, so charged with emotion and triumph, that the entire first-class section would never forget it. In fact, by the end of that journey, the businessman's life and everyone's view of Chuck Norris would be changed forever. This astonishing episode occurred on Flight QF 1129, departing from Sydney's International Terminal. Passengers in the luxurious seats at the front of the plane had barely settled in when they noticed an unassuming figure stepping through the aisle. He wore slightly scuffed cowboy boots, a rugged leather vest, and that unmistakable cowboy hat perched low over his face. Yes, it was Chuck Norris in the flesh, but he blended so discreetly into his surroundings that some people did a double take just to be sure it was really him. Many travelers recognized him right away. Others had only the faintest inkling that this man, who seemed so casual and so calm, was a legend in martial arts and action films, one of the greatest Hollywood icons ever. Despite his global fame, Chuck's bearing was modest. He was polite to the flight crew, nodding to the attendants as he found his assigned seat in row 6. There was no pomp or fanfare about him. He moved with the easy grace of someone who'd spent a lifetime honing discipline and physical skill. Yet there was a warmth in his eyes and a humble slope to his shoulders that put people at ease. No one expected any drama from him. If anything, the flight attendants and a few admirers were simply excited at the idea of sharing the cabin with the legendary Chuck Norris. However, drama arrived in the shape of Derek Langston, a prominent CEO who stormed onto the plane moments later. Dressed in a tailored Navy suit that undoubtedly cost more than most people's monthly wages, Derek radiated tension and frustration. His morning had been a financial disaster. A massive $50 million deal for his company, Langston Enterprises, had collapsed just hours before. The news had left Derek livid and humiliated. He was the sort of man who lashed out when under pressure, and that day he needed a target for his anger. It so happened that he spotted Chuck Norris, hat pulled low, boots showing their age, sitting in his row. The CEO glanced at Chuck's attire and made a quick, disdainful judgment. In Derek's mind, anyone dressed so casually in first class had to be in the wrong seat. Worse yet, Derek believed there was no way a person in scuffed boots and an old vest could afford a premium cabin ticket. The businessman bristled. He convinced himself that some ignorant passenger from economy had wandered in, hoping to snatch a better seat on a whim. Without so much as a courteous greeting, Derek demanded that the cowboy vacate the seat immediately. He looked around in a barely controlled rage, expecting flight attendants to back him up at once. Several onlookers, including an elderly traveler and a few curious teens, observed this confrontation with wide eyes, suspecting the situation was about to escalate. They recognized Chuck Norris, though Derek clearly did not. Tension seemed to ripple through the rows. People tucked away their carry-ons and turned their full attention to the spectacle unfolding near seat 6. Completely unruffled, Chuck remained calm, acknowledging Derek with a gentle nod. Even his posture suggested years of martial artistry, light on his feet yet powerfully grounded. The iconic actor and fighter had encountered all manner of brash individuals in his lifetime, but rarely had he seen such blatant arrogance at 30,000 feet, especially directed so rudely at himself. Chuck began to respond with measured politeness, suggesting that perhaps they check the seat assignments. But Derek would hear none of it. In a harsh, condescending tone, he declared that the seat was his, that this cowboy needed to return to his rightful place in the economy section, and that first class was not meant for people like that. At this point, a flight attendant tried to de-escalate, stepping in to verify the tickets. She knew Chuck Norris was indeed supposed to be in seat 6, but before she could finish, Derek cut her off, boasting about his own lofty position as the CEO of a major firm. He alluded to his vast wealth, his powerful connections, and insisted that someone dressed in worn boots couldn't possibly belong. His gaze flickered from Chuck's relaxed stance to his battered leather vest, and a sneer formed on his lips. It was clear that Derek's frustration and pride were fueling his every word. Chuck stayed patient, letting Derek rant. Passengers nearby began discreetly recording the scene on their phones. Murmurs spread. People whispered to one another that Derek might soon regret his outburst. A few recognized the potential for a viral moment, especially if the arrogant businessman discovered whom he was insulting. Derek Langston, however, remained oblivious to the identity of the man before him. When the flight attendant finally got a word in and confirmed that Chuck's boarding pass showed seat 6 while Derek was assigned to seat 9, Derek refused to believe it. He clutched his ticket, rereading it in growing disbelief. Seat 9 was further back in the same cabin, still first class but not nearly as private or spacious. Derek insisted that there must be some mistake, that he was meant to sit exactly where Chuck was. His face reddened with fury at the notion that he, a wealthy CEO, might have to concede. Over the course of a few breathless moments, it became painfully clear that the seat confusion was Derek's alone. Chuck had claimed exactly the spot indicated on his boarding pass. People braced themselves for a confrontation. The first-class cabin fell almost silent. A couple of children stared with wide eyes, and their parents looked equally nervous. A teenager recognized Chuck Norris instantly, trying to contain excitement while capturing every second of this altercation on camera. A hush swept over the space as Derek, brow furrowed, started to realize he was locking horns with someone who was no ordinary passenger. He didn't fully grasp the situation, though, and continued mocking Chuck's clothes, his boots, even suggesting that Chuck might have sold off some farmland to afford this seat. He loudly proclaimed that he himself had built an empire from nothing, that he measured success by how many zeros sat in one's bank account, and that no cowboy from who knows where would stand in his way. He then demanded that someone, anyone, call security, apparently believing he could have Chuck forcibly removed. Flight attendants gathered to calm Derek, quietly urging him to abide by the seating chart. They maintained professional composure, although a few had difficulty hiding their amusement at Derek's obliviousness to Chuck Norris's identity. The tension escalated further as Derek's voice rose, eventually drawing the attention of everyone in first class and possibly some in business class behind it. At last, a neighboring passenger, an older gentleman who had recognized Chuck Norris the moment he boarded, leaned over and calmly informed Derek that he was, in fact, picking a fight with one of the most famous martial artists and action stars in the world. This bit of information hit Derek like a thunderbolt. His tirade halted. For a moment, he could only stare at Chuck's weathered boots, the iconic hat, and the quiet, confident manner in which Chuck was regarding him. Understanding began to dawn. Derek, who had been so loudmouthed just seconds before, hesitated and swallowed hard. Could this really be Chuck Norris? The same man revered for his martial arts, his unstoppable roundhouse kicks, and countless iconic action roles? Derek cast a quick glance around, noticing the phone cameras aimed directly at him and the many faces watching his every move. A wave of realization washed over him. Not only had he insulted a living legend, but his childish meltdown had been witnessed and filmed by an entire cabin of fellow travelers. Worse still, those videos could easily surface online, humiliating him in front of millions. He was seething inside, but also rattled. The meltdown over the lost $50 million deal had clearly clouded his judgment, and now he'd funneled all that anger into a monumental mistake. Panic flickered in his eyes as he grew aware of the depth of his error. Passengers could see Derek's posture change. Shoulders drooped slightly, the arrogance draining from him. He was still processing the blow to his pride when he remembered the latest news about his company's stock plummeting after that failed deal. If the public got wind of how he'd berated Chuck Norris so crudely, he risked a second front of bad publicity that might be even worse. He felt trapped, unable to save face without appearing weak. Yet, astonishingly, Chuck Norris remained composed. Those nearby might have expected a flare of anger or indignation from him, but Chuck was no ordinary celebrity. He was a man who had spent decades mastering not just physical strength, but also personal discipline and humility. Rather than lash back, he stood there with the same unassuming confidence, offering a level gaze that seemed to penetrate Derek's bravado. Witnesses would later describe this moment as a testament to Chuck's character. If he had displayed even a fraction of his famed on-screen ferocity, Derek would have been put in his place, perhaps literally. But what Chuck did instead was far more surprising and, in its own way, more powerful than any physical move he could have executed. In that silent, tension-filled space, Chuck quietly indicated that the seat assignment was correct. Then, without aggression, he mentioned something about how life has peculiar ways of teaching humility. He didn't phrase it as a direct reprimand, nor did he speak with condescension. He simply conveyed that status and wealth can be fleeting, and that treating others with respect is a far wiser investment than flaunting money or power. Around them, phones continued to record. A child pressed an ear to the seat back, enthralled by every second of this unexpected drama. Some passengers nodded in approval at Chuck's calm handling of Derek's hostility. Others gave subtle smiles, marveling at how the fierce action star who had fought villains on screen for decades was displaying such patience and kindness. Derek, for his part, seemed to shrink under the gaze of so many watchful eyes. His face turned from red to pale, then back to red again. He struggled to form a coherent response. The humiliation was staggering. First, he'd lost the biggest deal of his career, and now he'd just belittled an icon of martial arts, on camera. Any attempt to save face by continuing to bluster would only deepen the hole he was in. And so, Derek reached a crossroads. He could continue his prideful rant, refusing to yield, risking a viral internet clip that would show him in the worst possible light. Or he could step back, swallow his arrogance, and acknowledge the truth. He was in the wrong seat, and he was insulting someone who had every right to be there. In that heavy pause, as the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, Derek's mind raced with fear about the consequences of his actions. He dreaded the damage to his personal reputation, his company's image, and the mocking headlines that might follow. Meanwhile, Chuck remained still, his composure unwavering, waiting to see how the businessman would respond. At this precise moment, with Derek's final decision hanging in the balance, something else was about to happen. Something that would send this story spiraling into an even more profound lesson on humanity and redemption. The moment of tense silence stretched across the cabin of Flight QF 1129 like an invisible barrier. Derek Langston stood rooted to the spot, eyes glued to Chuck Norris, still dazed by the knowledge that he had spent the last few minutes insulting one of the most admired action stars in the world. Hovering between brazen denial and the desperate urge to salvage whatever remained of his dignity, he appeared utterly torn. The passengers, already enthralled, braced for what might come next. Amid that suspense, one of the flight attendants stepped forward, trying to redirect Derek toward his assigned seat. She reminded him of his row and offered to help place his carry-on overhead. Derek, normally a domineering figure, did not immediately obey. His breathing was shallow, his thoughts racing. One might have expected Chuck Norris to capitalize on the situation, perhaps by sternly insisting that Derek leave. Instead, Chuck's stance conveyed neither anger nor triumph. He simply exuded a calm patience that communicated respect and empathy all at once. A few rows away, a child hid behind the seat back, eyes flicking between Derek and Chuck. The boy clutched his mother's hand in excitement, while an older passenger looked on with an expression of rapt attention. The tension felt monumental, the hush almost surreal. It was as if the entire first-class cabin had morphed into a stage for a life-changing lesson. Suddenly, a subtle ripple moved through the onlookers when Derek finally lowered his gaze. In what seemed an attempt to reset the situation, he began to shuffle away from Chuck, inching closer to seat 9, where he technically belonged. His shoulders sagged. He exuded a mixture of shame, regret, and reluctant acceptance. Yet, as he reached for the armrest at seat 9, he paused. It appeared that he couldn't quite bring himself to sit, still teetering between pride and the dawning realization that he had to make amends if he wanted any chance of redeeming himself in front of these passengers, and the cameras that were undoubtedly rolling. All at once, a stirring occurred near the front row. Another passenger approached Chuck with an apologetic posture, presumably requesting something. Observers watched as Chuck gently took a piece of paper from the passenger's hand, some kind of request for an autograph, perhaps. He scribbled a personalized note before handing it back with a smile. Then he directed a brief, benevolent glance at Derek, as if inviting him into a moment of clarity. Faced with the weight of so many onlookers, Derek sank into his seat at row 9, finally giving up his misguided claim to the wrong place. The overhead bins closed, the flight attendants resumed their duties, and the pilot announced final preparations for takeoff. Despite the usual announcements humming through the speakers, the emotional charge from the confrontation still hovered in the air, like static electricity that refused to dissipate. When the plane rumbled down the runway heading toward the skies above Sydney, Derek's mind whirled. He felt physically present, yet emotionally adrift. No amount of expensive tailoring could hide the turmoil under his crisp suit. There was no question that he had humiliated himself by unleashing his fury at a man he had wrongly deemed beneath him, only to discover he was addressing a global icon of discipline, humility, and generosity. Derek considered the magnitude of what he had done, offending Chuck Norris, quite possibly destroying his own image, and ignoring every basic rule of human decency. As the aircraft ascended, the cabin lights softened, and the seatbelt sign blinked overhead. The once loud businessman grew uncharacteristically silent. The usual first-class offerings, a glass of champagne, a plush blanket, and a menu of gourmet selections, were waiting for him. Yet Derek displayed no interest in them. Replaying every harsh remark in his head, he realized this could be the greatest public relations catastrophe of his life. He wondered how many fellow passengers had recorded him and whether they were already posting on social media. Had he just ruined his career further on top of that massive financial loss he'd suffered earlier in the day? Farther up the aisle, Chuck Norris settled comfortably in his seat, crossing one boot over the other. He exchanged courteous smiles with the flight attendants who moved through the aisles, distributing beverages. Every so often, Chuck would briefly glance back in Derek's direction, not in hostility, but with an air of genuine concern. Passengers who noticed the interplay felt a swelling sense of awe at the scene. Here was Chuck Norris, an international superstar, quietly showing compassion toward the very person who had belittled him minutes ago. Eventually, the hum of the engines grew steady. People began reaching for books, tablets, or headphones. Some wanted to catch up on sleep, others were eager to start a movie. And yet, a pervasive sense lingered that something more would happen between Derek and Chuck. The first-class section seemed to be holding its collective breath, anticipating the next chapter in this emotional journey. The next wave of drama arrived in the form of a phone notification. A teenager seated across the aisle from Derek tapped her mother, pointing to a trending social media post. It seemed that the early part of the confrontation had already been uploaded online. Whispers circulated among a few passengers who realized that the video was gaining rapid traction. Derek, noticing the murmurs, felt a jolt of anxiety. He recognized that every minute of his meltdown might soon become public. At the same time, he couldn't look away from the feed. He was transfixed by the thought that, within hours, the name Derek Langston might be a top trending topic for all the wrong reasons. Chuck Norris, keenly aware of the stir, made a small gesture to get the flight attendant's attention. Observers later recalled that Chuck exchanged a few quiet words with her. Although the exact content wasn't audible, it looked as if Chuck was putting in a request on Derek's behalf. The attendant nodded thoughtfully and left to check with her colleagues. Moments later, Chuck stood up and approached Derek with measured steps, stopping just beside the row. The cabin hushed once again. Even the rustling of newspapers seemed to cease. With composed courtesy, Chuck suggested that Derek accompany him toward the galley area, where they might speak privately. It was a remarkable, gracious move on Chuck's part, giving Derek a chance to address the situation away from the unblinking stares and the numerous phone cameras. Derek hesitated, but something in Chuck's calmness and sincerity guided him to follow. Heads swiveled as the two men disappeared toward the curtained-off corridor, leaving the rest of first class to speculate on the conversation that was sure to unfold. In that secluded space, flight attendants gave them a respectful distance. Chuck and Derek stood facing each other, the hum of the jet engines a quiet backdrop to their intense exchange. There were no prying eyes, no phones capturing every second, just an opportunity for Derek to express remorse and for Chuck to share perspective. Observers in the cabin could see only silhouettes beyond the parted curtain, but the posture of both men suggested a dialogue that was earnest and heartfelt. By the time Chuck and Derek returned to their seats, Derek's expression had shifted dramatically. He appeared almost relieved, though his cheeks were still flushed with embarrassment. A sense of closure hung around him. Passengers speculated that Chuck had provided some personal words of wisdom, perhaps even forgiveness, easing the heavy weight from Derek's shoulders. This fleeting hush once again settled over first class, laced with a tangible sentiment of hope. Hope that Derek had gleaned an invaluable lesson, and hope that Chuck's unwavering composure had sparked a genuine change of heart in the embattled CEO. Once they were both seated, the flight continued more or less normally, but the mood was far from ordinary. Off and on, people exchanged smiles of admiration whenever they glanced at Chuck. Others who recognized Derek from business news articles sent him measured, if somewhat cautious, nods. Some tried to catch his eye, silently communicating a mixture of pity and curiosity. For his part, Derek seemed introspective, occasionally running a hand through his hair and staring out the window into the wide expanse of clouds. Gone was the domineering scowl. In its place sat a man wrestling with regret, and perhaps for the first time in years, confronting the limits of his own pride. Hours into the flight, a fresh development occurred that shifted the emotional tone again. A flight attendant approached Chuck, carrying a small slip of paper, a pen, and a photograph. The photograph showed a child, bald-headed with a hopeful smile, evidently battling a serious illness. The attendant explained the situation, urging Chuck to consider writing a note of encouragement. Chuck immediately responded, scribbling words of hope and strength. Passengers nearby pretended not to eavesdrop, but they caught glimpses of Chuck's gracious act, which reinforced the cabin's perception of him as someone who embodied kindness beyond the celebrity mystique. At this point, Derek observed the moment from a short distance. He seemed touched by Chuck's sincerity toward a sick child he had never even met. Something about that small gesture, so effortless yet so meaningful, left Derek visibly contemplative. He realized that while he himself had spent most of his life chasing financial deals, Chuck Norris had been quietly investing in human connections. In that instant, a stark contrast emerged between Derek's definition of success and Chuck's approach to living a purposeful life. There, in the middle of a flight thousands of feet above the ground, Derek finally recognized that empathy and generosity were sometimes more potent than any corporate portfolio. The remainder of the journey presented Derek with ample time to think. He recalled the monumental deal he'd lost in Sydney. He agonized over the looming headlines that might further damage his business. And yet, a glimmer of resolve began to form. Maybe, just maybe, he could reshape the narrative by taking responsibility for his actions. After all, the only path to true redemption was to confront one's errors head-on. When the plane started its descent into Los Angeles, an air of anticipation filled the cabin. After such a tumultuous flight, everyone seemed eager to see how Derek would handle himself once they reached the terminal. Would he slip away unnoticed, burying his shame and trying to dodge reporters? Or would he bravely address those who had witnessed his meltdown? Just before landing, an unexpected moment occurred. Derek mustered the courage to stand and approach Chuck's row once more. It was a short interaction, likely an expression of gratitude and apology. The few passengers who noticed wore small smiles, interpreting Derek's gesture as his way of confirming a newfound humility. The plane touched down at LAX with a bump and a roar of reversing engines. Travel-weary passengers stirred, preparing to disembark. The seatbelt sign went off, and bags were lifted from overhead compartments. There was a low hum of quiet conversation, much of it regarding the extraordinary scene that had played out during the flight. People speculated about the online reaction, the corporate fallout, and whether Derek would seize the opportunity to make amends on a grander scale. At the aircraft door, Chuck paused to acknowledge the flight attendants, signing one more autograph and shaking hands with a few staff members. Right behind him stood Derek, who wore an expression that conveyed awe and, more importantly, humility. Outside the aircraft, cameras flashed. Paparazzi and reporters who had caught wind of Chuck's presence swarmed to capture a photo or a short clip. Derek's presence in the frame, though initially overshadowed by Chuck's star power, did not go unnoticed. Some recognized him as the CEO who had narrowly escaped financial ruin. Others would soon discover his identity through the viral videos recorded by fellow passengers. In the days that followed, the story exploded online, garnering millions of views and countless reactions. People dissected Derek's haughty tirade, marveled at Chuck's quiet but firm response, and applauded how the action star had guided the situation toward an uplifting lesson instead of fueling animosity. Talk show hosts discussed the event. Social media platforms buzzed with commentary about the stark difference between Derek's cold elitism and Chuck's unassuming warmth. Many regarded Chuck's actions as among the greatest demonstrations of class and generosity they had ever seen. No spin kicks required. Derek, confronted with a landslide of public criticism, initially felt consumed by anxiety. However, he also recalled Chuck's private counsel, delivered calmly in the galley. Rather than retreat into anger or denial, Derek decided to address the public head-on. He issued a statement acknowledging his mistake, praising Chuck for his measured response, and promising to reevaluate the corporate culture at Langston Enterprises. He confessed that losing the $50 million deal had sent him into a tailspin of rage, but that the flight encounter had opened his eyes to a deeper truth. Success does not excuse cruelty, and wealth does not entitle someone to belittle others. The response to Derek's statement was far more forgiving than he had anticipated. A significant portion of the public commended him for owning up to his error, especially when the easy route would have been to remain silent or dismiss the entire incident. Media outlets ran segments highlighting how a negative viral moment could transform into a catalyst for self-improvement. Some observers even credited Chuck Norris with facilitating one of the most surprising public reversals of attitude in recent memory. In the weeks that followed, Derek instituted changes in his company's policies. He mandated empathy training for executives and employees, aiming to reduce toxic behavior in the workplace. He personally sponsored community programs, donated to charities that supported underprivileged youth, and supported medical research for children battling serious illnesses. One memorable gesture involved shipping a collection of comfortable boots, similar to the pair Chuck wore, to some of the firm's top managers with a reminder printed on each box, stating that character should be measured before wealth or social standing. Meanwhile, Chuck Norris continued his usual schedule, practicing martial arts, making appearances at charity events, and surprising fans with quiet acts of generosity. His team occasionally fielded questions about the infamous flight, and Chuck simply reiterated that everyone makes mistakes, and that true strength is measured by how quickly one learns from them. He downplayed his own role, focusing instead on how Derek had chosen to correct his errors. This humility further cemented Chuck's reputation as one of the most grounded individuals in show business. Months after Flight QF 1129, a remarkable scene took place at a charity fundraiser in Texas, where Chuck was the guest of honor. To everyone's surprise, Derek arrived unannounced, wearing a subdued suit, without a flashy tie or showy watch. He stood in a quiet corner, observing the benefit in progress. Organizers soon spotted him and insisted he join the main reception. At first, Derek seemed awkward, uncertain whether his presence would be welcomed or cause a stir. Chuck, noticing him, invited Derek to stand up front as a contributor to the cause. The two men exchanged a handshake that onlookers described as a heartfelt symbol of mutual respect. By the end of that evening, Derek had pledged a substantial donation to the fundraiser, explaining that it was partly inspired by the flight to Los Angeles and the humbling realization that giving to others is a profound form of success. This moment brought the journey full circle, from a heated confrontation in first class to a shared dedication toward helping those in need. Attendees cheered and snapped photos, inundating social media with renewed praise for the ongoing redemption arc that had begun high above the Pacific Ocean. For many who followed the story, Derek's transformation stood as a testament to the power of humility. While the initial viral video showcased his arrogance, the lasting impact became the subsequent video clips of him working with charitable organizations, giving talks on corporate ethics, and acknowledging Chuck Norris as the catalyst for his newfound sense of integrity. In a world often marked by cynicism, the entire episode sparked conversations about second chances, personal growth, and the fact that even the most stubborn among us can learn vital lessons given the right circumstances. Throughout it all, Chuck Norris never once boasted about his part in Derek's awakening. In interviews, he consistently attributed any positive outcomes to Derek's willingness to change. That very attitude, quiet, humble, steadfast, only enhanced Chuck's legend, convincing fans and critics alike that he was more than an action hero. He was a teacher in his own right, championing the idea that true strength emanates from kindness, empathy, and moral fortitude. The ripple effects extended beyond Derek's company. Other business leaders took note of Langston Enterprises' metamorphosis. Some introduced empathy-oriented training, some increased charitable contributions, and a few even looked for opportunities to incorporate philanthropic projects into their corporate agendas. There was a newfound awareness, triggered in part by a humiliating meltdown on a flight, that one of the greatest measures of success is how you treat people when you think nobody is watching. Finally, the saga of Derek Langston and Chuck Norris served as a reminder that life's most hilarious and amazing transformations sometimes emerge from moments of intense adversity. A single plane ride, marked by a petty seat dispute, blossomed into an enduring parable of redemption, humility, and genuine heroism. Public memory often shortens quickly, but in this case, the legend continued. People frequently revisited the viral video to see how a man blinded by arrogance found surprising salvation in the presence of an unassuming cowboy-hatted superstar. At the close of this extraordinary story, the lesson resounds. True class has little to do with a ticket or a title. It shines through in how one responds to conflict, how one grants forgiveness, and how one lifts others up, even when it's easier to knock them down. Chuck Norris exemplified these values on that flight, and Derek Langston, shaken and humiliated, chose to embrace them. The result was a profound shift that touched not only Derek's life and business, but also countless onlookers who witnessed the unfolding drama in person or through viral media. In a world saturated with fleeting scandals and short-lived controversies, this event offered something far more enduring: the possibility that every spectacular mishap can become a springboard for self-improvement. For those following along, the message couldn't be clearer. Pride may stumble, mistakes may go viral, but within every fall lies the opportunity to rise again, stronger, wiser, and most importantly, kinder. And so, from the moment a furious CEO hurled insults at an unassuming cowboy in worn boots, to the day those same boots symbolized a life-altering transformation, Chuck Norris and Derek Langston's story remains a beacon of redemption. Humility is priceless. Empathy can transform even the worst of days, and true strength is demonstrated through lifting others up. Let this serve as a reminder that life's greatest lessons often emerge from the strangest and most hilarious situations, reminding all of us that no individual is beyond hope or beyond the power of a second chance. If this incredible journey inspired you, consider sharing your thoughts and stories in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more uplifting tales and life lessons. The next time you see someone who might appear out of place or different, remember Flight QF 1129 and recall how Chuck Norris proved that genuine success transcends material trappings. After all, a single act of kindness could spark the greatest change of all.